Chapter 14, Agriculture and Food Resources. Worldwide, we maintain what's called grain stocks. And basically, this is to ensure food security for places in the world where there may be bad harvest years. So food security basically deals with having access at all times to an adequate amount of food that's needed for people to maintain healthy, active lives. The world grain stocks that provide this measure of food security are basically the remains of harvesting from previous years, the excess basically, that's stored. And again, it's basically a cushion or a buffer against when there are years with poor harvest, or perhaps the costs are too high for the people that really need the food to be able to afford it. The grain stocks had been rising, but in the last 10 to 15 years, they've actually been decreasing since highs in the 80s and 90s. It's estimated that the stockpile that we had in 2010 would have only fed the world for 72 days, which is still above the bare minimum that the United Nations has indicated of 70-day supplies. But again, the trends have been downward, and because these are largely controlled by, at least to a degree, unpredictable events, droughts that decrease harvest, etc., there certainly is some concern when the grain stocks get to that level. So again, this is to provide the ability to be able to provide other countries with grain in years when they can't provide enough for themselves. Worldwide, it's estimated that there are about 1 billion people who lack enough food for their healthy, productive lives based on information exchanged at the 2009 World Summit on Food Security. And as you would imagine, most of these people live in the rural areas of the poor developing countries. It's estimated also that over 180 million children under the age of 5 suffer from undernutrition based on data from the World Health Organization. Undernutrition is a type of malnutrition in which there just isn't enough calories provided or the relative nutrients that keep our bodies healthy, and therefore it can lead to a weakened body which can be more susceptible to disease. It can be responsible for creating this idea that we term sort of this downward spiral. People in these developing countries are basically trying to work their way out of poverty, and again, most of them are literally growing all their own food, providing their own housing, doing everything they need for their own survival. And so when they suffer from inadequate nutrition and it weakens them, they have less ability to provide for themselves and their family, and so that then creates a problem where they maybe can't earn enough money or grow enough food to be able to sell to earn enough money to buy other food items they may need for survival. So again, it creates this downward spiral that the poorer their nutrition gets, the less work they're able to do. The less work they're able to do, the less they can afford to buy food that they need for their survival. And so it just gets hard to get out of this sort of downward spiral. So going back to this idea of undernutrition, because there are so many people in the world that really depend on maybe just one or two food items, much of Asia, it's grain primarily in the form of rice. So even if they receive enough calories a day in rice, which maybe they eat for their only meal or meals of the day, they still can suffer from undernutrition because they don't get enough balance in the nutrients or proteins or vitamins or minerals that their bodies need to be healthy. Again, we think of the calories that we take in from a balanced diet of meats and vegetables and grains and a bunch of other things, for perhaps 2 billion people in the world, again, all, if not most, of their food intake in a given day may come strictly from rice or from one of the other grains, without really, again, being able to have a balanced nutrition. So they may fill their stomachs up at night, but again, their bodies don't get the full range of nutrition that they need for healthy survival. This graph shows the distribution of the food problems in the world. And again, you look at areas like Asia and the South Pacific, where we have pretty much a third of the world's population, if not probably more than that. Asia, India, Indonesia, those areas. 63% of the food problems come from that region of the world. A little over a quarter from the sub-Saharan Africa, that large brown shaded area you see in Africa. The only reason that there aren't problems in the northern part of Africa is basically because virtually nobody lives there, because that is the Sahara Desert. And then you can see lesser amounts in the rest of the world, with only about 2% of the world food problems occurring in the highly developed countries. In the highly developed countries, the bigger problem tends to be still a nutritional problem, another type of malnutrition, but a type of malnutrition where basically there's an overconsumption of calories. And not just, again, sort of good calories, but diets that are high in saturated fats and sugar from items like soda, salt, especially from all of the prepackaged items that our society eats, all the stuff that's ready-made and easy to eat, throw in the microwave. And so these kinds of malnutritions, overnutrition, result in high blood pressure, obesity, greater likelihood of a lot of diseases related to diabetes, heart disease, other things like that. And again, this is a opposite problem from what we talked about in the previous slides with undernutrition. And it's mostly a problem in the highly developed countries, of course, because we have a greater income, so we can afford to buy more food, more things that basically aren't healthy for us. Even though we're better off financially, we still basically haven't completely solved our nutritional problems because, again, we've substituted things that we can afford to buy, but that aren't necessarily healthy for us because of their pre-made nature and all the preservatives that are added to those foods. 66 countries around the world are considered low income and food deficient. Again, primarily the less developed countries. And what we're talking about here are countries that, as a whole, can't produce enough food for themselves, or, again, because they haven't become industrialized, they don't have a lot of economic support in place, they can't afford to import and purchase the food they need from other countries. And so this leads to the chronic problem of food insecurity, where these people live basically day to day and usually not getting enough food in a given day. 22 countries, again, primarily the sub-Saharan Africa, are commonly, daily experiencing food insecurity. It's pretty much a given that world hunger, population, and poverty, along with the environmental problems that we as humans are creating, are all tied together to a greater or lesser degree. The more people there are, the more food we have to be able to provide to feed those people. We already talked about the challenge of resources not being equally distributed across the planet. So again, it's not necessarily a matter of worldwide not being able to grow enough food, but again, if we can't get it to the people that really need it, it's still a huge problem. And when you look at large percentages of the world's people living in poverty, living in that downward spiral that I was talking about, that's nearly impossible to get out of, it's going to be a challenge to address these problems until we start looking at some of the hard issues dealing with managing, or the book uses the word controlling, human population growth. So, kind of reaching a point when the human population in the earth has stabilized, promoting economic development, of course, help those countries become self-sufficient economically, so they can afford to buy the products and services that they can't provide for themselves. And then, maybe from my perspective, the most important of these issues is find a way to deal with that inequitable distribution of resources. Again, today we could provide enough food for the world as a world. It's just a matter of getting it to the people that really need it. And ultimately, until we can solve that problem, there's going to obviously be an ongoing challenge. Now, the one issue with that, I guess, that I would point out is that sort of, to a degree, putting a Band-Aid on the problem, growing excess amounts of food and basically, giving it to the countries that need it the most. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I guess the perspective I'm trying to put on this is that if other countries are providing food to support countries that can't support themselves, the countries that can't support themselves, will they ever have a reason to kind of move through the demographic transition and move towards becoming self-sufficient? If other countries can continue to provide for them, what will be the motivation for them to kind of move towards becoming self-sufficient? So definitely a lot of challenges, but ultimately it's pretty hard to deny the role that the human population has on the availability of resources on this planet. So far, we've been able to keep up with food production, at least from the world grain production. It's doubled or nearly doubled over the past 40 years, which seems like that alone would kind of be a big step towards being able to deal with this food insecurity problem. But keep in mind that the world's population has also grown, so ultimately the amount per person of grain hasn't really changed. Doubling the world's food production, grain production, has just barely kept pace with the human population growth. The Dodging Doomsday video touches on the issue of, we can keep doubling food production, but probably not forever, and yet the human population has the potential to grow exponentially, not just doubling. So at some point, will the human population growth outweigh the ability to keep doubling food production? By 2050, which again isn't that far into the future, farmers are going to have to grow about 30% more food than they are today to feed the estimated 9+ billion people that are expected to be on the planet. And again, that doesn't even address the problem of getting the food where it's needed. Because again, the amount of grain per person varies hugely by country. The more developed countries, relatively speaking, have a higher percentage than the less developed countries. And remember, again, it's not just about growing grain, wheat and rice and corn, because that's not going to solve the problem. Because again, rice doesn't provide all of the vitamins and nutrients that a person needs to be healthy. So again, what's the underlying cause of undernutrition? Ultimately, it's poverty, because if we had money, if any given person had money, they could afford to buy food. So poverty in food or lack thereof is intimately tied together. And generally, again, it's going to be, as with diseases and other problems, infants, children, and elderly are going to be most susceptible because, of course, infants and children don't have direct control over their own income, and the elderly, especially in the less developed countries, get to an age where they can't provide for themselves anymore, so they're dependent on other people to be able to provide food for them. And then, to compound that, not only do these folks not have money, but they also don't own enough land typically to grow enough food for their families, again, to grow enough food volume-wise or quality-wise. And then, of course, that also means they don't have the money to buy more land or to purchase the food they need. But again, as we all know, poverty isn't restricted simply to these developing countries. It is a problem in the United States as well. So ultimately, solutions are going to have to include looking at continued increased sustainable production of food, which is almost an oxymoron. I mean, to keep growing more and more and more food on the same amount or less land means we're going to have to put a bigger and bigger strain on the land to grow these foods for us. And it probably means we're going to have to add more fertilizers, more pesticides to keep the production up. So that greater and greater demand on our land is going to put more and more strain on our land. So it's going to be even harder, I believe, to be sustainable on into the future if we continue to have a greater and greater demand on our land. And again, once again, the solution has to involve better distribution of the food. And then, again, part of the solution also has to include reaching some level of sustainability when it comes to our human population size. And sustainably, it would imply, of course, that we are only at a number of people on the planet that the planet can support or sustain. And again, a lot of people believe we're already past that number. So if there are 9 billion of us or 10 billion of us, I can imagine it's going to be even harder to try and maintain a level of sustainability. One of the ways we've been able to keep up with population growth with respect to growing more and more food is because of industrialized agriculture. In highly developed countries and some developing or transitional countries, we use high input agriculture. Requires a lot of money and a lot of energy in the form of fossil fuels, for example. It doesn't require as much land, and it requires less manual labor than traditional methods. Although you look around California at a lot of the fruit industry, there's quite a bit of manual labor that's required for that type of agriculture, not for the growing 1,000 acres of cotton or something. That's pretty much all mechanized. But there are other types of agriculture, even in the industrialized countries, that still require a lot of human labor. So the challenge with this, and the challenge with trying to use industrialized agriculture in developing countries, is that it depends a lot on fossil fuel, which isn't cheap. It does produce high yields, which is the benefit, but it also tends to result in a lot of monoculture. Again, thousands and thousands of acres of the same crop. And that type of agriculture, because it typically also requires a lot of chemicals to sustain it, it can result in greater amounts of soil degradation and challenges with things like pesticide resistance. So again, there is a cost for this industrialized agriculture. This graph just sort of kind of illustrates what I was just talking about. Sort of the purchased inputs that are required for industrialized agriculture. Again, stuff that costs money, and basically the production aspect through harvesting, packing, transporting, storing, processing, and then ultimately again the disposal that's required for all of the byproducts that are generated. Not to mention again all of the potential damage that can be done to the environment when this is the normal type of agriculture and it's done over long periods of time. So you compare that extreme with the type of agriculture that's utilized typically in developing countries, which is called subsistence agriculture. It's the traditional method that people have used for basically as long as they've been on this planet to one degree or another. It requires, again, a lot of labor. It requires a lot of land, especially in places like the image in the background here, sub-Saharan Africa, where the land just isn't that productive. And with a lot of labor and a lot of land, there's usually just enough food to feed that family on a year-round basis. But again, not necessarily providing them with well-rounded nutrition. The type of agriculture certainly varies by area, just depending on what's possible in that area. But examples include shifting cultivation, slash and burn agriculture, where they'll knock down all the vegetation, burn it to release what nutrients there are in the vegetation, grow a crop for a few years, and then once that soil is kind of depleted, they'll move on to another spot and do the same thing over again. Nomadic herding, which is what's going on in the background here. Intercropping, trying to grow one crop with another one in between the rows. And polyculture, where you're trying to grow multiple crops in a given area. Again, the specific cultivation method depends somewhat on the culture of the area, kind of what's been the traditional method, or again, largely what the area is suitable for. Jumping back to the U.S., we have over 300 million acres of farmland that we cultivate that's considered prime farmland, which means it has the best soil, the optimal growing conditions, suitable amounts of water to be able to grow food or forage for cattle, fiber crops, oilseed crops. But even in the developed world, in countries like the United States, there are still a lot of challenges that we face in addition to many of the things we've already spoken about earlier in this chapter and in this class. In addition to other challenges, we're losing prime farmland to development, typically housing, those types of things. We also are seeing a declining number of domesticated varieties, going from a wide variety of varieties of corn or wheat or whatever crops to fewer and fewer that have been developed or engineered to be the most productive. Again, whether it's nature or from a cultivation standpoint, declining diversity is ultimately not good for the environment. Monoculture, simplifying the environment, can leave it susceptible to problems. We continue to improve crop and livestock yields. That's why we've been able to keep doubling our crop production. But again, there's certainly going to be concern that we won't be able to sustain that forever. And then certainly in the developing countries, the rules, regulations, environmental laws that are in place are going to be continuing to challenge us to be able to not damage the environment while still being able to produce the food items that we need. One of the big challenges that I just spoke about was basically in the developed countries, I mean, like the United States, a lot of our prime agriculture land is being lost to housing, shopping malls, parking lots, new roads, basically, again, construction related to things that we as humans value. And it's not just that land is being lost, but again, prime agricultural land is being lost. You drive up and down I-5, and a lot of the areas that you look at, areas where the casino is in Corning and other housing developments, used to be agricultural land. Maybe not for crops, but it might have been for grazing cattle. And so the Farm Bill in 1996 basically was one bit of legislation that was designed to address this problem. The Farmland Protection Program allowed for the voluntary sale of conservation easements, which were designed to prevent farmland from being converted to any use other than agriculture. And that length of time could have been from 30 years, basically forever, that agriculture land could never be converted to anything but agricultural land. Yet it still allowed the farmers to maintain full rights to their property for farming. So they weren't limited to what they could farm or how they could use their land. It just couldn't be developed. And again, the long-term preservation of our farmland clearly is one of the important steps that we need to take. If we keep losing farmland, prime farmland worldwide, that will eventually seriously impact our ability to keep providing enough food to provide adequate nutrition. I mentioned a minute ago also about the monoculture that we tend to create by not only farming large acres of one crop, but also because of the trend of having fewer and fewer varieties of plants and animals that are the domesticated varieties. A lot of the local varieties that were developed that were suitable for the climate or the precipitation patterns have kind of been bred away to be more uniform with respect to size, color, and to be able to reach the maximum level of production. Again, I mentioned this before, I'm sure, but again, we are pretty spoiled when it comes to shopping. We go into the produce section to buy some apples, and we want the big, colorful ones that don't have blemishes, don't have any type of damage to them. If there's a apple or an orange or a banana on the shelf that's just not quite right in our mind, it'll sit there and then get thrown away at the end of the week. So because of that, because of us, because of our notion of we got to have a perfect banana or I don't want to buy it, agriculture has been really forced to do this, to create breeds that are uniform so that they can sell them all, so that we don't reject them when they get to the store. And again, unfortunately, what this is creating is a lower level of genetic diversity. We have different nutritional values that are being impacted, but again, it's monotonizing the size, the color, the flavor, how resistant these fruits are to diseases. So again, they look good to us. We're just basically decreasing diversity, and should there be problems in the future, that could create an issue. Again, diverse habitats are always more resistant to changes, whether we're talking about a natural habitat or a human-created habitat. So because of that, because there are people that are worried that if we keep trending in this direction, there could be a problem potentially in the future, there is this movement to conserve the germplasm, which is basically the plant or animal material that can be used in breeding these plants and animals back in the future if necessary. So the seeds themselves, along with plants, plant tissues from all of these traditional crop varieties are being conserved so that again there may be the potential that if we need to bring them back in the future, we will still have that material there. And so that's being done for plants as well as for the traditional livestock breeds, where we're saving the eggs and the sperm. So again, there would still be the possibility that we could bring those back into production in the future if necessary. So again, ultimately we talked about the need to increase crop yields if we're going to be able to address some of these challenges. All of the advances we've made scientifically since the 1940s have allowed us to continue growing more and more food per acre over the course of time. We can see the yield increasing in the 50s, which was measured as bushels per acre, from around 16 or 17 up to in excess of 45 bushels per acre in 2010. So we've been able to dramatically increase food production in highly developed countries like the United States. Some of that's come from just breeding, choosing and creating varieties that do better in different climates like we've talked about. But a lot of it also comes from the use of fertilizers and pesticides, things that can also and do have the potential to have a negative impact on the environment. Part of what happened in the decades of the 60s is this notion of a green revolution, the kind of development of a lot of high yield varieties of some of these grain items that are, again, important worldwide. Traditional rice plants that are shown in the image would have been taller plants, not as much actual grain per plant, to where then hybrids were created in the 60s that not only had higher yield, you can see how much more dense the actual rice grains are on the top of the plant, but also they were bred to be more resistant to disease. So in theory, then we could use less chemicals on them and still get a higher yield. To the varieties that have been created in the 1990s that were even higher yield, again, disease resistant, but now also shorter and stronger plants that could support the heavy grain so that the plants wouldn't lodge or tip over and then maybe be more susceptible to depredation by animals, mice or whatever. And then again, also the plant isn't wasting as much energy just trying to keep the foliage alive and green. You can see how much thinner the actual foliage, the green parts of the plant are. So more of that energy can go into producing grains of rice and less energy into producing the actual plant itself. Again, the challenge is that these high yield varieties require intensive agriculture. In the 1920s, for example, Mexico was producing less than 7/10 of a metric ton per hectare. But by the 60s, as they also kind of moved through the Green Revolution, their wheat production rose by about 4 times what it was in the 20s. The challenges and the criticisms to this production of high yield varieties and highly industrialized forms of agriculture is that it can make these developing countries, who are neighbors to the developed countries, make those developing countries like Mexico dependent on bringing in technology from their industrialized neighbors at the expense of maybe losing some of that traditional agriculture that may have been, again, more normal for that country. So again, the technology costs money. The industrialized agriculture requires a lot more energy cost, more fertilizer, more pesticides. And so again, there's always the trade-off. More yield typically means more input, more money. And so those developing countries, neighboring industrialized countries, oftentimes end up with even greater environmental problems than they had prior. They can provide more food to their people, but they also then create that environmental damage, potentially. So now that we're past the era of the Green Revolution, we know that the demand worldwide for those core grain crops like rice, wheat, and corn is going to keep increasing as long as the human population keeps increasing. And that's not only the grain items, but livestock and the other products that we are utilizing agriculture for, biofuel production. So basically, we know that our future demand, as we predict it, is not going to be able to be met the way things are today. We're going to have to keep finding ways to be more productive, grow more food, use more land to be able to grow more food to meet those demands. We also know that we need water to do that. And California this year alone is a good example of where the ag industry is being allocated record low amounts of water. How much is that going to drive up food prices here? As much as we'll complain, we'll be able to afford to buy the food from other countries, but when we have these challenges in less developed countries, they just go without and millions of people die. So with challenges into the future regarding water, the continued rising cost of fuel, chemicals of all sorts, the continued challenges with with maintaining soil quality, the continued challenge we're going to face trying to just maintain the overall quality of our environment is going to be hard to sustain with our current trends. There's no doubt that it's going to be possible to continue developing higher and higher yield varieties, but it's not going to come cheap. It's going to take a lot of money, and again, that money has to be recouped in the future. So the seed from those higher yield varieties is going to continue to get more and more expensive, along with probably everything else that's going to be required to grow those food items. We know that a big part of this problem is going to have to be addressed by providing those developing countries with the better technology so they can grow enough food to feed their own country, rather than, again, the traditional methods of agriculture that they're doing now. But again, that's going to have to go hand in hand with those countries becoming more economically sustainable themselves. Again, unfortunately, we know right now a lot of the economic export of those countries tends to be their natural resources, which leads to further environmental damage. So it's going to have to go kind of hand in hand, that as they develop economically and they become more service oriented rather than selling their trees and their other natural resources, which typically leads to environmental degradation, they're going to have to move through industrialization, become service oriented rather than product oriented maybe, and then along with that become industrialized with respect to agriculture. One of the many concerns worldwide is when we start looking at increasing livestock yields. Certainly people are concerned, a lot of people are concerned about all the chemicals that go into growing our food items, like corn and wheat and so forth, and the potential negative that those chemicals can have on the environment. But there's also, and maybe even to some degree, greater concerns when it comes to the things like hormones that we use in our livestock industry to promote faster growth. It's pretty typical in the United States and Canada that farmers and ranchers use varieties of hormones that are basically used to keep animals producing milk for dairy cows, to basically get those young animals growing quicker so they can be sent to market quicker. The European Union right now restricts the import of cattle from U.S. and Canadian farmers because of the fear of what the side effects those hormones may have on things like the development of our children. And they also are concerned that the introduction of these chemicals into the human body, especially young people who are still actively growing, can result in higher incidence of things like cancer. The FAO and the WHO say hormones found in beef are safe, and that when you actually measure the levels of those hormones, they're typically less than what is found in the human body. Antibiotics are used in livestock just like they are in humans. In livestock, it's to, again, help weight gain, to obviously keep them healthier, free from disease. But just as with humans, when we use them indiscriminately or excessively, we can create very resistant strains of bacteria to the point where we have to keep creating stronger and stronger antibiotics, and they become less and less effective because we are developing resistant strains. So, although the WHO says that hormones are safe, they also recommend the elimination of antibiotic use in livestock, mostly from the perspective of this this development of resistant strains. A lot of European countries have complied with this recommendation, but as of right now, the United States has not yet complied with this. So we've mentioned things like environmental impacts from agriculture. Certainly air and water pollution are potential negative impacts from using fossil fuels, pesticides, fertilizers, animal waste that can build up in areas where large number of cattle are or livestock are raised. And certainly when these things get into the environment, we know what a lot of the potential negatives are, but we also don't know everything about what these chemicals can do to the environment. We know that excessive use of these things does, or has the potential anyway, to reduce biodiversity in the natural environment. Chemicals that get into our waterways can harm fish and the aquatic organisms that live in a river that are food for fish or are responsible for keeping that environment healthy. We know that excess chemicals can reduce native species and actually encourage outbreaks of nuisance species. The idea of algae blooms that we talked about in earlier chapters. Another potential, well, not potential, but another real challenge has been the trend of replacing smaller family farms with large agribusiness conglomerates. So from the mom and pop farm that was pretty typical going back even to when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, to, again, these large businesses where we have livestock being grown in feedlots and in factory settings. And just like any large business, there's the greater potential for air and water pollution when you have things concentrated in a smaller area. The challenge with pesticide resistance, just like with antibiotic resistance, same issues occurring there based on the heavy use of pesticides with these large industrial farms. Residues that are contaminated, killing fish, killing aquatic species, reducing the diversity within our soil organisms. Anything, again, that we do to decrease diversity in the natural environment can only be negative ultimately to us, the humans, in our environment that we're surviving in. Land degradation continues to be a challenge now and into the future. Anything we do to reduce the potential ability of the land to support us, again, whether that is natural land or agricultural land, anything that reduces the ability of the earth to be healthy and provide for us is only negative. Specific examples: soil erosion, compaction, salinization. Again, these are not problems that are unique to agriculture, so don't get the idea that I or the book, I guess, is bashing agriculture as being a terrible thing. It's just another thing, like improper forest management or improper construction practices that lead to problems like soil erosion that create problems for us to keep living in this environment. Habitat fragmentation, whether again it was done in the past by breaking up large blocks of land for farming or for anything else. When we fragment the habitat, we clear forests, we start farming patches of grasslands, we drain wetlands for building homes on. Anything we've done in the past and anything we do in the future that takes the land and breaks it up into smaller and smaller patches is going to make it that much harder for the environment to stay healthy and to keep providing everything that we need. So this image kind of summarizes the first of all, the challenge with resistance over time, how a very small percentage of our environment was affected by creating resistant strains of things, to within the last decade basically getting up near 16% from maybe less than 0.5% back in 1990. And then again, a lot of the impacts of these large types of industrialized agriculture are listed on the right, things we've mostly talked about. Various issues related to air pollution, water, loss of biodiversity, and the degradation of our land. So again, these things should look familiar, not just strictly from the standpoint of agriculture, but again, anything that we do to our land, any use we have for our land, whether it's agriculture or forestry or developing it for human uses, parking lots, homes, etc., any of those things that we do to our land have the potential to generate more air pollution and have a greater impact on the water quality. And all of these things can combine to create loss of biodiversity. And those things can further degrade our land to the point where, again, if we don't deal with this in the very, very near future, we might create a place that is no longer livable in the future. So the book talks about solutions to these problems, and it talks about moving to sustainable agriculture. I think I might have went on this bender when I was talking about forestry, that the book was talking about, well, to solve the problem, we got to get more sustainable with how we manage our forests. And if I did or didn't talk about this already, I'll say the same thing with respect to agriculture. It's a little bit insulting to sort of make this broad statement that, well, we're not being sustainable today, so we got to fix that problem. And that really is not the case. As with, agriculture, the farmers and ranchers are no more trying to destroy their land and growing unsustainably than the foresters are managing the forests unsustainably. The people that do these things do it, to make a living, yes, but I would again argue that most of these people do this because it's their passion. Maintaining the family farm, or the greater good of being able to provide food for people, or products for people. So don't get the impression that agriculture isn't sustainable today. Is it 100% sustainable everywhere? No, of course not. Is 100% of forest management worldwide sustainable? No, of course not. But it's also not quite like I think maybe the book portrays it, that that we're not even thinking about this yet, because that's just not true. We have employed a lot of agricultural methods that maintain soil productivity and do a good job of maintaining as healthy a ecological balance as possible, while still being able to use that land to grow food or fiber. So there are a lot of things that are referred to as alternative or low input agriculture, where we're looking at combining our modern methods with some of the traditional methods, kind of taking steps backwards from what we were just talking about, trying to re-diversify crops and livestock so that we have that ability to maintain biodiversity, breeding resistant varieties so that we can use fewer and fewer chemicals, using irrigation methods that are much more conservation minded. We've been using drip irrigation and versions of that where even the drip line might be under the soil, so there's even less chance that it evaporates. We've been doing those things for quite a while now. Certainly there are probably going to be technologies that we develop in the future that'll be even better, but we are doing a pretty good job at doing a good job of conserving our water in many cases. Again, not 100%, because there are plenty of examples where you look around at wheel lines, where the water is basically sprayed on the crop from above, and that's far more susceptible to evaporation. A larger percentage of the water that comes out of a sprinkler is going to be lost to the atmosphere, and if it's lost to the atmosphere, obviously it can't make it to the soil and help that crop. But again, we'll continue to develop better technology, but we're doing a pretty good job as it is. We're rotating crops more than we have in the past to maintain soil fertility, using conservation tillage methods to preserve the integrity of the soil, recycling animal manure, planting legume crops to get the nitrogen back in the soil without having to use chemical fertilizers to do that. So again, there isn't just one single fix to this problem. All of these potential solutions can be combined depending on local needs or local conditions. And again, we are doing this. We'll continue to find better ways to do things, more efficient ways to do things. But again, it's going to have to happen worldwide over time. It can't just be one state or one country making these improvements. It's going to have to occur on a worldwide basis ultimately. So there's this notion of that we're in or we're approaching a second green revolution, where we're actually, again, kind of going a little bit back to more traditional forms, away from these high-yield monocultures towards, again, more long-term sustainability. Organic agriculture, which again isn't a new idea. Integrated pest management, which isn't a new idea. Using more than just inorganic chemicals to kill pests, using using biological approaches that use natural pest predators, for example. Maybe moving away from that more intensive agriculture and focusing again on long-term sustainability of the soil, maintaining the health of the soil, which will then be able to provide for our needs. So again, it's not that we aren't doing any of these things now. It's not that we aren't thinking about this at all now, but we'll continue to keep looking at better and better options into the future. Options meaning ways of being even more sustainable than we are today. And so this image kind of summarizes what the book considers to be sustainable agriculture: increasing biodiversity, managing wetlands, not draining them, but managing them, enhancing soil health, and minimizing erosion by the methods that we use. And again, probably of all these things, really focusing on biological processes, focusing on sustaining proper nutrient cycling within the environment, looking at energy flow, trying to maintain predator-prey relationships, rather than just, well, dump more fertilizer on it or dump more pesticides on it. So again, these are things we're doing, but looking at the big picture. A truly sustainable farm of the future might contain some timberland, and that timber might be managed. There might be wetlands that are created on farms that are used in the production of agriculture to recycle things, or clean water that's cycled through a farm. So again, just diversifying even a given farm and focusing more on the whole system rather than just one little piece of it. So this section ends with an enviro discovery. Locusts periodically increase in numbers across oftentimes some of the developing countries, and then these swarms can completely devastate food crops and trees, having a huge impact on that environment. In 1998, African farmers dealt with these locust swarms by spraying massive quantities of pesticides. Again, they pretty much felt like they didn't have a choice, but there was concern about the effects that these chemicals could have on the environment. Again, the trade-off of how much chemical do we need to spray to get rid of the locusts, but then how much damage might this do to the environment? So basically, because of those concerns and the amount of money that it cost, they developed non-chemical biological controls, basically things like fungal spores that would only target the locust. It'd basically infect them and kill them, and not have any other negative biological effect on the environment. So these biological control methods turned out to be far more environmentally safe and very effective at controlling the swarms. And now basically as of like 2009, the use of these biological controls have prevented other major locust infestations in other places in Africa. So again, we've been using biological controls in this country, and other places in the world now are certainly realizing the benefit of that as well. Things you can do in your own garden instead of using chemicals by default, pesticides or herbicides. Buy ladybugs, buy praying mantises. Research what predatory bugs, and you can buy these in seed catalogs and other horticultural magazines. Put some of those in your garden every year. Yeah, there are going to be there are going to be native ladybugs and so forth around, but if you buy some egg pods, or you might buy them in a dormant state, put them in your garden in the spring when you start planting things. Just look at alternatives, in other words. Don't default to go grab a chemical to spray when you got a problem. Research some of the natural solutions to these challenges. A lot of people believe that, again, with the potential human population increase in the future, we're going to have to rely a lot more on a certain type of technology to really be able to address these problems. That technology being genetic engineering, manipulating genes to produce a particular effect. The book uses one example of taking a specific gene from one species and putting it into an unrelated species. One example worldwide is this idea or this plant that's been termed golden rice. So basically, we already talked about how rice doesn't provide the people that depend on it as pretty much their only food item. It doesn't provide them with all of the other nutrients and vitamins they need. So one engineering solution to that is to inject genes into rice plants that basically create some of the vitamins that would never normally be in rice. And so people are still eating rice, but they're also now getting some other things that their bodies need to be healthy. This certainly has the potential, and to a degree it already has, revolutionized agriculture and medicine, with the goal ultimately being to develop desirable characteristics as opposed to breeding them into plants, which has been the traditional method for thousands of years, using technology to insert desirable characteristics into crops and livestock. And so these kinds of engineering solutions have the potential to create more nutritious plants that contain, again, vitamins, nutrients, amino acids. Pretty much any given plant could contain most everything that a human needs to survive and be healthy. But then other benefits could be, again, injecting the genes of a plant that are resistant to certain diseases into plants that aren't resistant, being able to create drought-resistant plant varieties, varieties that are resistant to excessive heat or cold, those that are resistant to herbicides. So now you could spray a certain herbicide over a crop and it wouldn't kill the crop, but it would kill all the weeds in theory, and so forth. Basically, an engineering solution to address any problem that we might have with respect to growing food, whether it's plants or livestock. Your book goes into a little bit of detail on how this would actually work, so you might want to review that. I don't plan on getting too bogged down talking genetics and DNA in this class, but in a nutshell, it involves taking or finding a desirable gene in one living thing and putting it into another living thing so that that other living thing now has this new characteristic. And again, those characteristics could be just about anything that we as humans desire or prefer with a given plant or animal. These genetically modified crops go back to the 1990s when they were first approved in the US. Since about 2000, genetically modified crops have been grown in developing countries, even faster rates than in the developed countries like the US. In 2011, developing countries produced about half of the world's genetically modified crops. So again, some of that infusion of technology into the developing countries. And again, the benefits is that these types of genetic engineering solutions have allowed for more productive animals that grow faster, reach maturity quicker. The ability to produce crops that allow greater disease resistance, plants that can be modified that allow them to be resistant to insect pests, that can be resistant to herbicides. One of the examples of that that's drawn a lot of criticism are the Roundup Ready products like Roundup Ready soybeans, which were developed by the company that makes Roundup. So you could plant these Roundup Ready seeds, soybean seeds. The soybean grows, and as it grows, you can spray it with Roundup, and it only kills the weeds, but not the soybean. And again, that Roundup still pretty much will kill everything else in the field, which again decreases diversity potentially, and still can have the potential negative side effects that any chemical can have on the environment. But it makes it very efficient for a farmer to be able to just spray that on the crop without having to avoid spraying it on the plants. Certainly when you start talking about genetically modifying plants or animals, there are clearly things that jump to mind where people are concerned about this thing. In 1999, the European Union basically placed a moratorium on GM foods. It's been lifted since then, but there was about a decade, I guess, where they weren't allowing any genetically modified food items to enter areas governed by the EU. They refused to buy corn from the United States, since at this point about 80% of U.S. corn is in some way genetically modified. Many of the concerns include the challenge of spreading these modified genes to wild relatives to these crop plants, and that if these genetically modified genes get into the native vegetation, we can't even predict maybe what types of challenges or problems could come up. And we apparently do have a lot of other concerns related to that. Even ideas that, some of the big concerns were that if you were a farmer not using genetically modified crops next to a farmer that was using genetically modified crops, how could you now guarantee that your crops were not being impacted by the genetically modified crops? Pollen blowing into the non-genetically modified crops. And so if I'm selling my food item specifically as not genetically modified, but my neighbor is, again, how can I now be 100% certain that those genetically modified genes aren't getting into my crop? There are certainly worries consumers have largely about things like developing allergies, or let's say that you have an allergy to peanuts, which seems to be even more common now than maybe it ever has been, and not sure why that is. But what if a gene from a nut crop was inserted into some totally unrelated food item to give it whatever benefit, and then somebody consumes the food item that's been genetically modified with this nut crop gene? People are concerned that there's not 100% reliability that won't create the same problem that would be created if I just ate the nut itself. The scientific consensus is that health risks associated with eating genetically modified food items is the same as it is with any other food item you eat. There always will be people that are susceptible to problems, but basically what they're saying is there's no higher risk. However, again, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. We haven't been testing this long enough to know what some of the long-term impacts may or may not be. So much more research in the future will continue to occur to try and address some of the concerns that people have. So certainly one of the issues that we can address in a variety of ways is increasing our crop yield by decreasing the other living things that want to eat that, the pests basically. So a pest is any living thing that interferes in some way with human welfare or things that we do or things that we value, like agricultural crops. Some of these pests compete with us for food because they eat some of the food that we grow in the field. And certainly another big issue is some of these pests can spread disease that could affect or kill humans. And for a long time now, we've been using pesticides, which are designed specifically to reduce pest populations, to increase food yields. And these pesticides can be broken into insecticides for killing bugs, herbicides for killing plants, rodenticides for killing rats and mice, fungicides for keeping fungus from growing on our crops. So all of these chemicals have been used for a long time as one of the ways to increase our crop yield. We decided a long time ago that the benefits outweighed the risk because effectively controlling these pests, especially when they spread disease that can result in human death, things like malaria, typhus, for example, any negative side effect, which we really didn't think about it at all when we first developed some of these chemicals. It was just about this chemical saves humans, that's all that matters. But ultimately, we know that these chemicals then were used on crops to protect them from pests and pathogens, which otherwise might destroy about a third of the crop. So that's a third more crop now that we can harvest and provide humans with food. We also know that because of the increasing monocultures, the single species of crop being grown over very large areas, that basically was a cultural factor that also tends to increase pest populations. If you've got a pest out there in the field, let's say you've got 10 different pests, and one of them likes corn plants and one of them likes something else. If now you're growing nothing but corn, you certainly have the potential to dramatically at least increase the population of that pest that tends to focus on corn. And so because of that, a lot of times pests would thrive because there's a lot of food for them. Whereas again, in more complex ecosystems that have a lot of different species, you'll have predators and parasites that can help control those pest populations. Whereas again, in a monoculture, and with the heavy use of chemicals, you may have reduced those natural competitors. And now you get in the sort of no-win situation of having to use more and more chemicals just to get the same outcome. An ideal pesticide would be narrow spectrum, meaning it only kills the thing that you want to kill and nothing else. It would also break down quickly in the environment into compounds that are not toxic in any way. And then third, you would have a chemical that doesn't move through the environment. It doesn't get into the groundwater where it could move into a nearby stream. It would degrade quickly and basically not move and not cause problems. And while there are some pesticides that are ideal or nearly ideal, most pesticides are the opposite. They're broad spectrum, meaning they kill almost everything. They don't degrade readily. Some of them, again, do, but a lot of them don't quickly break down into other things that are less dangerous. And many of them do enter the water, whether it's groundwater or other water sources. Some of them can volatilize when they're sprayed and actually get into the air and create problems there. So again, we've certainly moved towards more narrow spectrum, safer chemicals. In the past, pretty much none of them were like that. But now a lot of them are much more ideal, much safer to use in the environment. One of the biggest problems, though, that we still have, and we've touched on this already to a degree, is the ability of the continued application of a given chemical, pesticide in this case, to create a very resistant population of pests. In the 50 years, roughly, of heavily using pesticides, it's estimated that at least 500 plus species of insects and mites and about 84 species of weeds have evolved based on being sprayed with chemicals. They've evolved resistance now to certain chemicals, to where we've had to develop different chemicals or stronger chemicals just to have the same kill rate that we did in the past. And again, whether we're talking about plants in an agricultural setting or humans, we have created very resistant strains of living things that now are harder and harder to control or to kill if they get to a point where they are out of control. It may be impossible to completely get rid of them now. A lot of these pesticides that have been used for decades and decades have the very negative side effects of being able to accumulate in the environment, or more typically in living things, to magnify up a food chain. We also have, again, killed off a lot of the natural or beneficial organisms, resulting in less natural controls. So an even greater need to use chemical control. The movement of these chemicals into our water supplies have created a greater likelihood of us being exposed to them, and some degree of an elevated risk of diseases and cancer from exposure to some of these chemicals. There are chemical examples of around the country, around the United States, of chemicals that have been banned for decades that are still in water supplies, wells that had to be shut down because they were so contaminated with certain agricultural and industrial chemicals that they may never be able to be used again. And there's no way to clean the water table either. We just have to sort of let it heal naturally, which could take a very long time. So again, we've been aware of those things, and that's why there are a lot of chemicals now that we just don't use anymore, because they were deemed to be too dangerous. This graph shows just one example of a red scale in California. We're going back to the 60s. If we look at the untreated trees, the trees that were not sprayed with DDT, and compare that to the red line, this line represents the density of this scale. And notice that even when we were spraying chemicals, after we sprayed, a population might have dropped, but what's the overall trend? The scale density just kept growing and growing and growing despite spraying a pretty nasty chemical, DDT. And again, that's completely because of the resistance. We've killed off the weakest of the weakest and left the very strong ones to breed and make even stronger offspring, so that when we spray again, fewer of those die. And again, we've killed some of the weak ones, but we've left the strongest ones behind. Whereas if we had never sprayed DDT, we would have basically not really had a negative impact on the population of scale. It stayed below what's termed the economic threshold. So again, an example of where we use chemicals and created a bigger problem than if we had never used that chemical. So again, lots of alternatives to pesticides, starting with biological controls, natural predators, natural disease organisms, natural parasites to control problem pests. The use of chemicals like natural chemicals like pheromones and hormones, substances that are produced by the actual insect or by other natural things that we're trying to control, that would, for example, attract them to a trap, so that we can trap them and get rid of them, but not use chemicals to do it. Just use natural pheromones to attract them to a trap. Reproductive controls, ways of introducing some sort of chemical into a a population of living things that basically creates them from reproducing. So therefore we don't have a growing population. Genetic controls, quarantining products going in and out of an area to keep undesirable things from finding a way to get into a state, and California is probably more careful with that than probably any other state. Using irradiation to basically sterilize or nuke the undesirable species. So it's lots of interesting biological and other types of controls that we do use, and we can probably use even to a greater degree than we currently do. And all of these things tied together is termed integrated pest management. We're combining the best of all possible pest controls that are used in the right order at the right time to keep pest populations small enough so they can't grow to the point where they can start having a negative impact on the crops that we grow. Negative impact meaning that we can't grow as much, which then prevents the economic loss of that crop to the farmers. So again, using natural enemies, resistant varieties, the right cultivation practice, using pesticides, but using them cautiously and in the right amounts to not create bigger problems. Using pheromones to trap or lure the pests. So again, using whatever technique is the best technique or combination of techniques for a given situation, and focusing on, again, those natural ways of controlling problems. So this is certainly going to be important into the future as we continue to try and move towards even more sustainable agriculture. And I guess it's probably a mindset as much as anything. The item there that talks about combining a variety of methods to control pests, like I've already said. But again, I think the mindset is managing, not eradicating. The idea of, I gotta get rid of everything. Eradicate all the weeds, eradicate all the pests. That mindset probably needs to be changed for us to really move into true sustainability into the future. Again, the idea of managing the pest population, not focusing on eradicating everything. Using biological and genetic controls as much as possible. Using conventional pesticides only if other methods fail. And again, incorporating an understanding of the environment to choosing the best method that'll work for a given situation. Table 14.1 talks a little more about some of these methods, these alternative methods of controlling pests. So you might want to review that, how these methods work and what some of the disadvantages are. Again, there always will be advantages and disadvantages with anything, whether it's more biological or whether it's a strict inorganic chemical. There are going to be advantages and disadvantages. So again, it's about knowing those advantages and disadvantages and still choosing the right suite or collection of methods that meets our objective. And this chapter then ends with a case study of organic agriculture. Basically, in this case, they're talking about no usage of inorganic fertilizers or pesticides, only organic fertilizers or pesticides. The Organic Food Production Act of 1990 specifies guidelines for what can be classified under the idea of the organic production of foods and how these things are labeled. The federal standards went into effect in 2002, and by 2008 there were 2 million hectares farmed organically in the United States, about 5 million acres roughly. Actually, that's the other way around. Hundreds of thousands of acres farmed organically in the U.S. There's a lot of growth within the organic agriculture industry today. One thing I would kind of mention here is that keep in mind that organic agriculture still is not a solution to every one of our problems. It's definitely better that we use fewer and fewer inorganic chemicals. But what is an organic chemical, and are all organic chemicals better than all inorganic chemicals? Well, no. There are some pretty harsh, nasty chemicals that are organic that in theory can be used and still create organic food. Things like the liquids that can be generated from tobacco plants, pyrethrums. A lot of organic chemicals are still not selective. They still could, in theory, kill any weed or any plant they come in contact with. Or they could kill any insect, the good or the bad insects. My bottom line here, and then we could talk another hour just about organic agriculture, but the idea here is that everything that I've seen, and common sense, I guess, would tell you this too, organic food isn't more nutritious. An organic apple and a regular apple, an organic apple isn't more nutritious for you. Is it better for you? Well, maybe it's better for the environment to a degree. It could be better for the environment, or maybe it isn't, is I guess what I'm saying. All I'm gonna say in closing is if you want to buy organic food, that's great. Obviously, there are good things about eating organic foods from the standpoint of perhaps the lesser chemicals that are used to grow them. But don't get maybe suckered into the notion that organic food is inherently just better for you to eat. It may or may not be a lot better or a little better for the environment. And again, it just depends. So read labels. Go to the companies that are claiming to be organic. Just make sure you read what they do and how they do it, and then make the decision based on information. Don't just get suckered into falling for the word organic, because it could be one thing or it could be something else. And so again, just be an educated consumer and make sure you know what you're buying and what went into that item, what went into growing or producing that item, whether it was organic or whether it was more traditional forms of agriculture.